Jonathan sat, trembling in the dark. He stared at nothing, his eyes not penetrating the circle of blackness that surrounded him. A single lamp illuminated the round table he sat at, allowing him enough light to see the edges of it and nothing more. A teapot and half-empty cup sat in the center. With a trembling hand, he reached toward it and took it towards his lips, not truly looking at it as he drank. He set the cup down on a plate. The cup rattled against it, the only sound save for the thunder that rumbled in the distance. He heard a switch flick. Jonathan shut his eyes for a moment, temporarily blinded by the harshness of the light that filled the room. He opened them again to see a small, white kitchen. A single window and 2 doors broke the array of cabinets that covered the walls. Standing in an open door was Chris, Jonathan's friend and housemate. He had a hand on the light switch. "John? What are you doing? It's after midnight," Chris asked. Jonathan kept staring forward and did not reply. "John, answer me. This is the 3rd time I've caught you up like this. What are you doing?" After a moment's pause, Jonathan replied, speaking in a dry, quiet voice. "I had the dream again." He still stared, unblinking, toward the window, though he didn't seem to notice what was behind it. Chris flinched. For months now, Jonathan had been experiencing the same recurring dream. In it, he stood outside his own life, looking in at it. He saw himself live his own life, going through the same daily routine and experiences over and over again. However, something about it all seemed unreal. All his actions were artificial, all his conversations seemed planned. A strange feeling that something wasn't quite right filled him, and grew and grew. Slowly, and so gradually that he barely noticed, his actions were replaced with words. Instead of seeing things happen, he read them in a massive wall of text that described his every movement. His conversations came in quotation marks, which he read instead of spoke. Soon his entire life seemed to be a novel, running forward toward a conclusion that was always surrounded in haze. When he got to the end, he always awoke, but the feeling never left. Even sometimes when he was awake, he began to lose his feelings of normality. For brief moments, barely noticeable, he saw objects described in text rather than in their own form, and his own movements seemed to be described by a nameless narrator. Chris sighed and walked forward. He rested a hand on Jonathan's shoulder and spoke in a reassuring voice. "Listen, John, I know you're worried, but you have to remember it's just a dream. You've been very stressed lately and have started having nightmares. It happens. It's nothing to worry about." Jonathan chuckled slightly. "Oh, no. No, it isn't." "What do you mean?" "Look, John, get back to sleep. You're starting to scare me." For the first time that night, Jonathan stood and faced Chris. He was taller than Chris, and the shadow he cast obstructed Chris's face. "Don't tell me you haven't had that feeling, that creeping, inching suspicion that something isn't right. Doesn't everything just seem too dramatic, too convenient? This isn't how reality should be. This isn't how people should be speaking. This isn't how they act." Jonathan realized he was shouting and stopped. He breathed heavily and tried to calm down, resting his head in his hands. Chris looked at him with worried eyes. All right, John, here's what we're going to do. Just go back to sleep for now, and tomorrow we'll make an appointment with Dr. Limestone. She helped you with the dreams before, and... No! Jonathan said, shaking his head. No, I am not going back to Dr. Limestone. She isn't going to fix this. She isn't going to solve the problem. She isn't part of it. And I don't even think she's a character. John, what are you talking about? A character in what? The book! Don't you get it yet? I don't know if it's a comedy or a drama or what, but we are all a part of it, and I don't think she is. That was the most horrifying part of his dreams. He felt as if hundreds of eyes were reading the text along with him, learning his every movement, as if they were plot points in a story. He still had the feeling at that very moment that in a strange and twisted way, he was being watched, monitored, listened to. Chris stared at him, not knowing what to say. Jonathan stood up out of his chair and faced him, folding his hands in front of himself, as if pleading for Chris to understand. The teacup fell from his hand, shattering on the ground. Look, isn't that all just too convenient? Doesn't it ever feel that way? Listen! Listen to that thunder! Doesn't it seem like a perfect setting? And everything is like that! The lights when you enter, the teacup. By God! The way I'm standing! This isn't how things work, Chris! They don't come together to make themes! Weather shouldn't just suit my mood like this! Do you not see it?! Chris was taken back. Well, John, that's all very ridiculous. You see, storms happen, whether you're angry or not. The teacup was an accident. You dropped it and it broke. We can get a new one. Now, what is this about Dr. Limestone? What do you mean she's not a character? Jonathan went back to holding his head in his hands, frustratingly. I know I'm not going to see the doctor because she hasn't been described. I have no idea what she looks like. What? If this was real life, there would be hundreds of little insignificant things happening. I would know dozens of people and unimportant details, but that isn't real life. And anything that isn't part of the story won't be described. I'm not going to see Dr. Limestone. Outside of this conversation, she doesn't exist. We don't even know what she looks like. John, that's ridiculous. This is besides the point. Oh, really? Describe her, Chris! Chris opened his mouth to respond and stopped. He realized he truly had no idea. Well, she was a psychiatrist that helped me with the dreams before. Is that what you were going to say? Because that was established for this conversation. You have no idea what she looks like, do you? Chris paused. That was exactly what he was going to say, down to referring to Jonathan in the third person. It did seem odd. Well, that doesn't mean anything. We've just forgotten, that's all. We haven't seen her in months anyway. It isn't important. What is important is that... Stop trying to rationalize what fucking shouldn't be! There is no reason for us not to know what she looks like. It's just a plot device, that's all it is. Even what you just did there, trying to change the topic to hide what hasn't been fleshed out. This isn't how people act! Well, alright, but that still doesn't mean anything. It's just one person, okay? Describe our neighbors to me! describe your parents to me. Describe anyone, fucking anyone, that isn't directly related to this conversation. And I'll believe you. I'll go back to bed and I will believe you, and we will go see Dr. Limestone tomorrow. Chris stared at him in shock, not knowing what to say. He searched his mind for anything, for his neighbor's face, for his parents' image, and found utterly nothing. Over and over again he tried and came up blank. Oh God, I don't know. Maybe we're all just tired. Thank you, Chris. Oh, my want-to-be protector and savior who shines a light into my darkness. Nice imagery there, eh? Just like the storm. All right, then. What did you have for breakfast this morning? I don't know, but that's not important. Exactly! It's not important. We don't know anything that isn't directly important. Why? Why is that? Why the hell is that? It's just too goddamn convenient! Look, okay. If this is a house we've been living in for years, you should be able to answer me the question of what is behind that door. Jonathan pointed toward the closed door at the other end of the kitchen. I don't know. I don't know what to say. Exactly. There's no reason for two people who have lived in a household for years to not know what's behind a single door, Chris. It just wasn't relevant when you turned on the lights. So it wasn't described. All right, John, all right. Say you're right and we're just in a story. What then? Do we open the door? I don't know. It's there for a reason now. We've drawn attention to it. There's gotta be something important. So now you think just talking about things we can influence the freaking universe? That's insane, John. No, it must be! Look, it's like the tea. I had the tea so that the rattling glass and the broken cup could represent my emotions, and now that we have drawn attention to that door, it must represent something. This is how it works, yes? You turned on the light, flooding light into the darkness, but I denied it and pushed you into the shadow. For a second, he closed his eyes. He hadn't seen Chris hit the switch, but the words, "He had a hand on the light switch," flooded his mind in black lettering. It's all foreshadowing! So when the kitchen had two doors, one open and one closed, there is something important behind the closed one. Chekhov's gun, right? You came in from one to help me sort this out in part one, and part two occurs behind that door. Well, what then? Should we open it? I don't know! We don't know what's behind it. We don't even know what type of story this is. That's true. This could be a drama, an action, a comedy. That wouldn't be too bad. Perhaps it's all a joke. Oh, yeah. You want to live in a comedy. Yeah, you realize people are laughing at you. What if we're just two buffoons for people to mock? God, if we were just two cartoonish idiots, would we even have the intelligence to tell? Well, I hadn't thought of that. But it's better than a tragedy. I don't know. Look, we can work this out. It can't be an action. Neither of us really knows how to fight or carries any weapons. Jonathan spoke, realizing he established it as fact as he said it. I don't think this is a comedy. We would probably be able to remember funnier things happening. Then again, maybe we wouldn't as part of the plot, but I don't know. Hopefully it's a drama or a romance. Imagine if this entire thing was just to set us up with some perfect women, Chris said hopefully. I don't think so. Look, we should be able to tell what this is from our surroundings. The writing and descriptions should reflect what the plot is. We should see foreshadowing. Maybe we can pick it out. A slow realization began to dawn on Jonathan, though he kept guessing in his heart that he knew exactly what sort of story he was in. All right. Well, then what can we learn from the kitchen? Chris asked. Jonathan thought for a moment. Everything in this conversation and things that we have talked about revolve around me. I think it's safe to say I'm the main character. All right. Then what has happened to you recently? I'm worried. With the thunder, the darkness, the nightmares, the falling cup. I don't think this is a happy story. Something bad is going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. As he spoke, the thunder once again boomed on the horizon, and a flash of lightning filled the window with jagged light. Chris swallowed. All right then. Do we open the door? Neither of us knows what's behind it. I think it's safe to say we weren't supposed to know. Somehow you've broken the mold. Where do we go? Jonathan squeezed his eyes closed and gripped the back of his chair. He hadn't even realized he stood behind it. His knuckles turned white, and finally he spoke. If this is the sort of story I think it is, I don't think we have a choice. Either we go through the door and figure out what's behind it, or it's going to come and get us. If we are the main characters, then we should be safe. Usually they survive. Usually? Not always? Usually. Chris looked at Jonathan, then toward the door. All right then, we might as well get it over with. If I'm the sidekick, I guess that's my job. I'm the sacrifice? Chris, don't joke like that. Look, I don't know. Don't worry, it's like you said, we're safe, right? We're the main characters. We never die in the first act. Maybe it will just end up being a big joke. Though he was still terrified, Jonathan slowly nodded. He couldn't help but think that, by breaking their own plotline, they would no longer be safe as the heroes in a story. He feared to voice the complaint, as by saying it he knew he would make it fact. He watched Chris walk forward and open the door carefully. The hinges squeaked as it opened, and a cloud of dust came into the kitchen. It was clear the door hadn't been opened for a very long time. Beyond the door was near pitch black. Chris reached into a nearby drawer and took out a flashlight. He turned it on and shone into the darkness beyond, revealing a narrow wooden staircase that descended between two stone walls. He walked slowly down the stairs. Jonathan came behind him and followed into the unknown darkness. Chris reached the end of the stairwell and paused. He turned to face into a small room, shining his light around. Oh God. Oh God, John, this isn't a comedy. It's a horror. Jonathan followed his gaze to find his worst fears confirmed. The floor of the room covered with fine black dirt. Scattered across it were dozens of broken bones and skeletons, along with ancient weapons. The walls were covered with blood-red writing scrawled in dozens of languages, from ancient runes to modern letters in languages that neither person could understand. Run, Chris! We shouldn't have come down here! Jonathan shouted as he sprinted up the stairs. The entire building began shaking. The low rumbling he had once thought was thunder became a continuous noise that seemed to come from every direction at once. He ran toward the kitchen, but stopped in the doorway. The cabinets at the far end of the kitchen began to lose their form. They blurred, then turned into written words, becoming replaced with descriptions of themselves. Large white cabinet with silver handle, small thin cabinet with gold handle, electric oven, 4 stoves on top. The letters began to slide, mixing and forming indecipherable gibberish before disappearing into an ever-growing sea of inky darkness. Jonathan realized, having found out the truth and breaking his role, he had removed the very thing that held the plot together. By going outside of his own story, he had destroyed his fictional universe. Chris didn't stop when John did. He ran into Jonathan's back and they both fell forward. Chris didn't seem to notice what was happening and crawled forward, calling to Jonathan to keep running. Jonathan shouted at him, and Chris screamed as he finally saw the walls melt around him. He crawled and clawed back toward the stairwell, but was overcome by the descending wall of letters. His feet began to change, his face contorting into a look of incomprehensible horror as he saw his legs dissolve into letters and disappear. He kept crawling forward, but nothing he could do would change his fate now. Jonathan watched in terror as his friend dissolved into oblivion, the very universe he lived in dissolving around him. He turned and began to run down the stairs again, preferring the horror of the skeletons to the certain death in the kitchen. He stumbled at the bottom and collapsed onto the dirt floor. His head scraped along the ground, forming a long gouge over his right eye that blinded it with blood. With his good eye, he turned to see his fate. The oncoming wall of letters kept coming down the stairs and stopped at the base. The letters molded together, filling in all the white space and forming a black wall. Jonathan felt it and realized that it became part of the same stone wall that now surrounded him. Using the dropped flashlight, he looked around. He was trapped in a square stone room no more than 20 feet across. Jonathan sat in the center of the room, not knowing what to do. Time seemed to slip away, and he had no knowledge of its passing. He had no idea if he was there for minutes or days or years or even centuries. He simply remained trapped alone in the darkness. Though he may have guessed he was there for days, the flashlight never dimmed, and the blood never stopped pouring from his head. There was nothing for him to do, and he felt no reason to move. Along with an eternity to himself, he began to contemplate what had happened. He thought on his own life, of his existence, and how he had come to be. He thought about himself. It seemed wrong to think that way. Himself implied that he was an actual living being, and he wasn't sure if that was actually fitting. It suited him more to think in the third person, as he would have been written in the story. Was it fair to say he was ever anything more than that? A fictional creation? His thoughts turned to the room. He had no idea where he was, or how the poor souls who had become the skeletons that surrounded him had found their way into the small black cell. Perhaps he would join them. Perhaps someone else would come to inhabit the small space, and he would be gone forever. Perhaps it had already happened, and without a sense of time he hadn't realized it. The thought sent a chill down his spine. He didn't know what was worse, an eternal life in a cage or simply ceasing to exist with no sign that he ever was. With no sense of time in that strange world, who was to say that it hadn't already happened? Perhaps both were true in their own way. He realized he needed to leave some kind of permanent mark, so that somehow, maybe, another person might know he existed. He had to tell his story. With all the time imaginable to spare and no time at all to lose, he thought about what he had to do. After some time, though he had no idea how much, he stood up again. As if compelled by an unseen force, he walked toward the wall. He dipped his hand in the blood that flowed down his face and put it to the stone. He made lines which formed letters, and the letters which formed words, and finally the words formed a story. It began. Jonathan sat, trembling, in the dark.